Yeah, what you can't see, and we maybe should keep secret, I don't know, but the laptop is sitting on a bar stool that swivels. So that's where we can move it around, easily show you the whole group, and then come back. So
Why would you have a bar stool? Oh,
it's a
okay.
long story. We inherited them. You could call them captain's chairs, I
I like bar
suppose,
stool
but
better. Yeah.
yeah.
All right. Well, I wonder if someone would be interested in opening us in prayer this evening. Okay.
Sure,
All
I
right.
would be
Thank you.
prepared to do that. All right. We thank you, loving God, for the opportunity to come together again tonight as one group in two nations. We realize that the American part of our group has just recently celebrated Thanksgiving, and so we bring to mind those things that we are thankful for and the places where we have yearnings for a greater sense of your righteousness and justice and fair sharing of the earth's resources, which is so much part of that basic story of Thanksgiving. So we come before you, seeking your wisdom, seeking respect as we hear differing opinions, and seeking a sense of what it means to be those who are your beloved and those who beloved you, O God. So we gather and pray in the name of Christ. Amen.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So this evening we're looking at believing and faith, as well as, I believe, mercy and righteousness.
Hmm.
Some pretty serious terms.
Yeah.
I thought the chapter, if I can just dive right in with maybe a question, on believing and faith is an important chapter because, you know, the rallying cry of justification by faith was so important for the Reformation. And it's kind of become a recipe, I think, for Protestants for what Christianity is supposed to be about. And I don't know if anyone else maybe made that connection or was challenged in that way when reading that chapter.
Anyone want to pick up on that? Come into the hot seat? Not to put you on the spot, Cam, but any thoughts on that? Or not yet? Yeah, okay. If you could repeat the question, that would help.
I'm trying to think if I can phrase the question better. The chapter on believing in faith, when I first saw the title of that chapter, I immediately connected it to the Reformation slogan of justification by faith. And in my mind, I'm used to the idea that that's become in Protestantism that believing the right things is what's important. And that's the heritage of the Reformation somehow. I don't know if that was everyone else's experience or not. I think I made it worse.
Certainly, that was my experience growing up in the Lutheran Church. Confirmation was just a fully memorizing Scripture and Luther's Catechism. It was and then being able to recite it to church council. That was my early memories of the importance of believing in the statements or the creeds, all that, right? But certainly as I've grown older, I hope I've adapted more of the so-called pre-modern or the biblical belief where we have confidence that in Jesus, and it's more of a heartfelt relationship as opposed to believing in statements.
The one comment that caught my eye was you made a reference to the distinction between believing that versus believing in.
Could you repeat that last part again?
Yeah, come on.
In you come. Yeah, I just shared the comment that one of the comments that Jorge was, he spoke about the difference in believing that, which is sort of again speaking to that idea of knowledge or facts, as Cam referred to, versus believing in being a broader concept. It really resonated with me.
What do you folks think?
Yeah, kind of back to you folks on that. We're still on. There we go.
Well, who wants to speak to that? Well, maybe let's do a straw poll to get this started. Does anyone remember being taught that all you had to do was believe the right thing to be a Christian? Okay.
Okay, come on here.
All right. Do you still believe that? Why or why not?
I guess I kind of believe in things I read and things I was taught from, like I was raised Lutheran myself, so of course you had a lot of reading, but that's a long time ago I did that. But my beliefs are still, basically what they were then. But things have changed a little bit more as I got older, and different things. So I guess basically I still believe in the things from the catechisms and what I've been taught. So.
Well, can I push you on that?
Sure.
Do you believe that's what you have to believe to be a Christian?
No. I think a Christian is not just because what's written down. A Christian is being a good person, doing things for other people, and a number of things. You don't have to believe everything that you're taught, but it helps.
This is Rodney from Emmanuel, and I grew up in Emmanuel Church, and part of our Constitution says that we need to be taught in confirmation the Heidelberg Catechism, which is much different than the things that are written in this book. The Heidelberg Catechism seems to me, as I recall, is more heaven and hell type of thing, and it's more black and white. I mean, and we also were expected to memorize the questions of the catechism, and on Confirmation Sunday, or before Confirmation Sunday, there was an examination day, and we all shuddered because the pastor was there, and our class was there, and he could ask any question that he wanted to from the Heidelberg Catechism, and we were expected to know the answer as we stood before the congregation. So it was a lot more black and white, heaven and hell type of thing, and we were expected to believe because of faith.
Yeah, I grew up in the Catholic tradition, and we were taught what to believe in. Like you, we had catechism, and we had to memorize it and regurgitate it, and so on. Um, and I guess in some ways, if you accepted that, it made it easy because you had a framework, right? It was there, it was laid out for you. And then we weren't allowed to question really, so you weren't plagued by doubts and so on. If you didn't accept it, then that got difficult. Um, I think when you're looking at believing in, then there's more of a relationship. And so, as with all relationships, then you have to start thinking and pondering and evaluating, I think. So, it might not be so easy.
Hello there, it's Kathy. I grew up in the Baptist church, and it wasn't confirmation, it was baptism. And so I was the youngest deacon they ever had. I was 16. I was baptized though when I was 13. But I remember as a deacon having to go and interview people whose parents probably wanted them to get baptized. And I'll never forget the time that we went to this, and her daddy was a professor of New Testament theology. And we went to her house, me and the other deacon, and she couldn't tell us why she wanted to be baptized. And we would ask her in different ways and what she believed in different ways and try to prompt her, and she couldn't. So, of course, we were in a pretty difficult position. And anyways, in the end, she wrote us a letter as to what she believed in, and she got to be baptized in the baptistry. And then my other example of believing is a few years ago, I was working at a Catholic hospital here in Banff. And we were all of a sudden, I'd worked there for about 10 years, and we were all of a sudden given a piece of paper to sign, and the beliefs were there, and we had to sign that we agreed with it. Now, and that was just like a few years ago. Now, what I did, of course, was I scratched some things out because I couldn't do it, and I wanted to be honest, and I still wanted to keep my job. So they allowed me to scratch things out, and then I was able to sign it. And that happened maybe 4 years ago. But interesting, like, why do we have to pin down people's beliefs? I mean, and they change, don't they? Sort of a bit like the wind, and they change for me, anyways, depending on what's happening in the world. And I think sometimes your beliefs get shattered by personal tragedies. And I think, for me, anyways, that they sometimes get shattered. And I'll just tell you one more story. I guess I'm talking a lot, but oh well. Uh, I had a child who, when he was 7, he got leukemia, and I I really had a hard time with beliefs because I was in this cancer life, and I was walking through children's cancer wards and seeing all these kids with no hair and puking their guts out and dying, basically. And so I actually called the minister over and said, "You've got to help me. Like, how can I believe in a God that doesn't do anything but all these kids that I was immersed in?" And anyways, his answer to me, which was pretty interesting, was he quoted Elie Wiesel. Is that how you say the author's name? Wiesel, in one of his books, where people in a concentration camp were all standing there, and they said, "God, God, God, where are you?" And Wiesel's response as the author was, um, "I am with you. Like, I can't do anything, but I'm with you." So, anyways, in my little crisis, that helped a lot. And because my beliefs all of a sudden, I don't know really how to explain it, but my beliefs all of a sudden um, didn't really need to be shattered, but it was okay because there maybe was another answer. And by the way, my kid's okay, and he's going skiing with us tomorrow.
Hi there, it's Sim. As I said before, I grew up in Holland in a Christian Reformed church, and I did go to catechism class, but I wasn't confirmed because by the time I was 16, I had that many questions. I went to class, but I never went through confirmation. But I don't think I ever stopped believing. I went to university and I didn't go to church for a while, tried different things, Youth for Christ, all that stuff. But when I became engaged and then I married my husband, I really wanted the blessing of a church wedding. And when my kids were born, I wanted the blessing of baptism. Although I was never confirmed, I kept going to church, to an ecumenical church. And I finally was confirmed in my 50s. But then things weren't as serious as they were when I was 16, 17. So I finally was able to stand up, and I felt more like I was giving witness to that. I want to be a Christian. I'm doing my best to be a Christian. So that's my story.
This is Mike from St. Peter's, and I'm still waiting to grow up. I find Rodney's experience interesting. I think many of us who went through the reform process or the early U.C.C. process here at St. Peter's remember well the Heidelberg Catechism. And I think part of my faith journey that was really eye-opening was at some point along the line realizing that was just another legalistic method that humanity put on our religious belief structures. And if we instead think back to what we were told the greatest command is, to love God with all our heart, mind, and soul, that fits right into what Borg says believing is all about. And I enjoyed the pastor's use of the beloving in the opening prayer tonight, because if we can be about loving, if we can understand loving, that's really about the journey of the relationship of growing closer to our God from a trusting and a needing kind of a part on our behalf, rather than trying to fulfill 350 questions with just the right answers, or you're damned for all eternity.
Yeah.
It's Donna here. When you get right down to it, I don't think it really matters much what specific things, statements, or whatever you believe in. Each one of us can believe in different things, but what we do with that is what counts. And what does that belief then challenge me or help me to go out and make the world a better place or fight for justice, or, so that to me is more important than actually the specifics of what we believe.
Bill here from Emmanuel. I'm a bit different in that I'm from the St. Louis, Missouri area, and that is where the evangelical church of the evangelical reformed side, and confirmation for me was a 3-year process, and memorizing the evangelical catechism, which is, from what I understand, different from the Heidelberg Catechism, in that it goes through the 10 Commandments, and it works, and the questions and answers were things about the Apostles' Creed, and how we went from there. But it was a 3-year process, which you couldn't figure out today because kids are way too busy. And also, when this was in a suburb of St. Louis, Missouri, and there were 66 of us in the confirmation class. The post-war baby boom, you could say.
Yeah, indeed. It's interesting for me to hear the talk of a specific catechism, because that's when the United Church of Canada was formed in 1925. All of the Congregationalists came in, all of the Methodists came in, but there was a split in the Presbyterians. And a large part of that split was there was still a group of Presbyterians that wanted to follow the Westminster Confession, and they stayed out. Whereas those that were more interested in sort of being part of a Canadian church, as especially the West in Canada and Northern Ontario and some other places were still being settled, they came into the Union. And so right from the start, the United Church has been really clear, United Church of Canada, that we are not a creedal church. We do have statements of faith. We do have a creed that was first formulated in 1968 and is used now and then in worship. But there's not a sense that, well, if you don't believe this, then you're not A, part of the United Church of Canada, or B, a Christian, or C, saved. That's just not where an understanding of specific doctrinal or dogmatic belief functions within our denomination. Having said that, there's still lots of people that I think do have that understanding of belief that, you know, you get it right or you're in trouble of some sort. You know, I don't think that's super widespread, but certainly in some of the congregations I served 30 years ago, some of which were in fairly isolated rural areas, there was still a pretty strong sense that if you didn't have sort of the proper beliefs in God, then the heaven and hell framework did kind of click in a little bit.
This is Dennis. I was wondering, how does your confirmation work over there?
That's a really good question, because we have so few youth in our congregation that there hasn't been youth confirmation for a while. We have that adult confirmations, and we do actually use our creed as sort of a point of exploration of a variety of Christian understandings. But where I end up on that with people is, at the end of that, I want people to be able to articulate something of how they see themselves in relationship with God and relationship with neighbor. And that may be something that is quite closely aligned with our creed. It may be something very different from that. But that's the starting point of any sort of curriculum resources that we would have.
As we speak about this, our church, when Mike and I were confirmed, there was probably like 30 or 40 in the class. And nowadays we're down to 3 or 4 too, so we have the same type of issues. But we had over the years, what I know of, there was a lot of belief statements. Always had to write a lot of belief statements as they went through the process, and you had to, you know, create your own statement of what you were be confirmed with. So that's just my input.
So as pastor at Emmanuel, since like Rodney mentioned, our Constitution stipulates that the Heidelberg Catechism has to be part of the confirmation curriculum. We do give each student a copy of the catechism, and we use it throughout the 2-year program, not as a memorization kind of tool, but we look at the history and the story behind the document and who those people were and what was important to them as they were formulating these questions and answers. And then we try to invite ourselves to be in conversation with those people from 1563. How do we feel? What do we think about the answers that they're giving to some of those questions? Where maybe do we differ? And then the culmination of the confirmation experience, like Dennis was sharing, is each student writes a statement of faith that they present to the congregation on Confirmation Sunday. And it's not intended to be a regurgitation of, here's a checklist of ideas that I accept, but rather a testimony of, here's where I'm at. Here's some questions that I still have. Here are things that I struggle with. Here's how I think I experience God in my life. Here's how I intend to love my neighbor and put my faith into action. And I think that's really a helpful exercise that sort of gets us thinking beyond just the hard and fast questions and answers of the catechism to how we put our faith in action in the world. It's actually an exercise I'd love to get the adults at church to try sometime, to write their own statements of faith and share them publicly.
Sounds good.
Well, if I could take on the role of devil's advocate for a moment, hoping actually to use that to change the subject. Earlier, we were talking about some folks were offering the comment that believing isn't the end all of being, believing the right thing isn't end all being Christian, isn't the end all of being a Christian, but it has to do with more of how good of a person you are, or if you're working for justice or loving your neighbor, or so. Like I said, I'm going to play devil's advocate. What are you folks talking about? That's all works righteousness. That won't get you anywhere.
It's all works righteousness. All righty then.
Again, that's devil's advocacy. Okay.
It comes back to what I was to what I was thinking at the beginning, that when you were talking about the move as Protestants away from works righteousness to faith. That has, I don't know whether Luther had this happen for him, or if it's been even since Luther, but that seems to be a move from action to thought. So something that you sort of do to something you think. And what Borg would suggest is that the move should have been from something you do to a relationship that you have, or something that you feel. That sense of trust, that sense of God and Jesus as trustworthy entities to be followed, or to live with and to live by, as opposed to, well, I need to be able to formulate a thought in a way that will be acceptable to God. To say, no, I need to live a life that starts with that trusting relationship, and from there it may very well emanate back into actions. So instead of the action on itself being sort of what saves us, say, no, we'll move away from that to a relationship, and that relationship will urge us back into a proper relationship with our sisters and brothers. Anyway, just tossing that one out there as sort of where Borg's coming from.
I think Borg does a very good job in the book of saying that our relationship as it grows transforms us, and maybe transforms the center of our being to the point where we operate out of love rather than out of selfishness or out of other earthly desires.
Yeah.
There was some mention about what it means to be Christian, and well, just to me, I don't think you can be a Christian without considering Christ. That's what Christianity is. to try to live your life like Christ would, and to try to have Christ in your life. I don't think you can separate Christ from Christianity, which I'm not saying that anyone is, but I think that's the integral part.
Go ahead.
I over my life, just to give a few examples. When I was confirmed Lutheran and everything, as I got more away from the church as I got to be older and did different things with friends, and it wasn't important to me. And at that time, it was so strict. It kind of frightened me away from the church for a while. And as I got older, the schools I went to different schools. I got to meet different people from different religions, went to different churches, and just didn't reflect back to my Lutheran days when the only good church around was the Lutheran Church. And as I started growing older, I prayed to God a lot for certain situations I went through, and like they said, you need to have Christ in your life. It's definitely helped me a lot in the changes of my life, and all were for the good.
Interesting you bring that up, Larry and Rod both, and I thank you for your comments. It dovetails with something I read this morning in an article on the internet. It said, Jesus never said that we had to sit around and sing songs together on Sunday morning and pray together in a big building. And, following Jesus doesn't necessarily mean going to church on Sunday. Following Jesus is more about what Jesus taught us and what Jesus' example was for us. And church is a part of that because we have an opportunity to come here with other like-minded people and attempt to elevate that part out of the rest of our drudgery of the week. So I guess that's kind of interesting how the pastor who wrote that article said one of the challenges we have in churches is we're not necessarily going to get people because they believe in Christ just to come and attend on Sunday mornings. It's a different way of doing things these days. There are more people interested in being like Christ in their lives and showing it in their works than coming to church on Sundays.
I guess going back to calling ourselves Christian, I don't know. I always never thought I was good enough because I wasn't enough like Christ, I guess, to call myself a Christian. So I don't think I've ever said the words, I am a Christian. I'm probably quite distorted, and I'm not even, I don't even know if I'm ready yet to say that. Isn't that weird?
I call myself an emerging Christian. An emerging Christian. That means you're still learning. And it'll be till the day I die. But it's it's kind of a growing process, but it also gets down to the bad roots in me too. The selfishness, stuff like that. It is transforming, highly transforming. But when you first see that, when I first learned about this, through honest to God, and there was a great old book from the 60s. And from then on, I just had a thirst for reading theology. I was never had a commitment to go to be a minister. It wasn't strong enough. The next closest thing was a teacher. That was it. Yeah. But that's what I call myself, an emerging Christian. So emerging. Still being born again many times. Huh? What do you want to think about that, fantastic?
I just wonder if they could hear that. Maybe we could ask them if we could hear that.
So were you able to hear Don okay just then? Not entirely. So Don was talking about being an emerging Christian and the way that that's something that grows with life experience and with learning and reading and in essence being born again and again and again as Christian faith emerges. I think it's interesting that the direction the discussion's going, because in a way, I think it's very much that first point that Borg was making of saying, let's get the idea of faith and belief out of the head and into relationship with Jesus, relationship with others. And I think in a variety of different ways, we've kind of been talking that. I'd like to pick up on something that you said, Laura, about the confirmation process, because it got me thinking. You know, I've done that with young people as well, like having them write a faith statement or whatever. What would it mean to take that other understanding of faith and belief and say, so more so than a faith statement, to really zero in on that part of, as someone who in whatever way defines myself as Christian or being connected to what we hear from Jesus, or however they define that, who am I going to be in the world? To really zero in on that aspect of it, because I mean that call for authenticity is what I hear most often as one of the reasons why the next generation isn't adhering to church as much as those who are the age of our group. Anyway, I just wondering what do others think here about, you know, if we did a confirmation class and the end goal of it was to say, tell us who you want to be in the world, more so than saying, tell us what you believe.
So, to try to bring in another chapter we read for tonight, what role does righteousness play in how we act on our belief?
So righteousness, like I guess what Borg was saying, I got to look at my notes because I read it last week, was that he was talking about about not doing what is right more as much as a fair distribution of God's earth and economic justice and sort of distributive justice. And I think that spoke to me really well, because the words righteousness, I mean, it always had this little twang to it that I had trouble with, because oh, he's righteous. Well, he knows something, and he's going to get somewhere, or he's better than I am, and that just didn't self-righteousness sort of was in there too. So I really did like the feeling that that distributive justice was what a lot of the message was, and thinking too that who Jesus was speaking to were mostly the poor and mostly peasants, mostly people in that were well, just not wealthy and in rural areas. So that was important for them. They they needed to have a little bit more wealth than what they already had in order to eat. You had a thought?
I just, yeah, it just made me think when we were talking about believing that and believing in. And so if you think of righteousness was someone who followed, you know, the list, right, of what was to be believed, to believe that. Whereas justice would come from believing in. Right. But I thought maybe righteousness was more, because I was thinking of the Pharisees, right? And how Jesus would get upset with them, right? Because they suppose, you know, were following what was they were told to do, but they weren't living it. And so I'm wondering if that's sort of a different way of looking at it.
Righteousness is my behavior.
I'm wondering if the word righteous is just such a church-bound word that unlike a lot of these other words, he's able to sort of say, well, here's what the dictionary means, and that's kind of irrelevant on this one, because I don't think of righteousness being a word that has a societal use outside of church. You know, it's a very musty, churchy word. I think it could be worth reclaiming, but it's very church bound. I don't know that righteousness, however we define it, is going to be a word that really reaches to another generation.
Yeah. So it
can be. I mean, he tries to make it not exclusive, but I'm not sure.
I'm not saying from his
Right,
approach,
yeah.
but just how we lived with that word.
Yeah.
Don't like it, or I don't like it.
I don't like it.
One of the comments you made that
Oh, you have to go over there.
One of the impressions that I had when I read the chapter, and I just had looked back to see how he worded it, but when you talk about the righteousness of God, it's beautiful language, it's powerful language, but it's when you talk about individuals as righteous, I think that's where it changes how you feel about the word. That's where it starts to become uncomfortable a little bit, at least for me. So, but it's one of those words. It's a very powerful word. It's a very beautiful, appropriate word in a lot of ways until you start extending it beyond that. So I took that away when I read this chapter.
I struggle with the legalistic definition of righteousness. And I really liked when they talked about righteousness and justice as being the same thing. And other synonyms I use for justice are fairness. And one I really like in this example is balance. And righteousness being our balance with God, our balance of spirit, and also the balance of all things God has given us, not individually, but collectively as a people, and balance with other peoples as well. So in that sense, striking out for justice is striking out for fairness and balance, and it makes it a lot easier for me to envision than that, like you call it, a churchy word.
Does everybody here have struggle with that word, or?
This is Rodney from Emmanuel. We talk about God being a righteous God and God being a just God. When we look at Genesis in the Old Testament, there must have been something going on in the earth that God didn't like, because he sent the flood. And he chose Noah and the animals to survive the flood. So there must have been something that showed that God was showing his righteousness or his justice or exhibiting his justice onto the rest of the earth to destroy just about everything except the people and the things that he chose.
I just had a song come into my mind. Joy to the world is just while we're talking about the word righteousness. The glory of his righteousness and the wonder of his love. Like there's a context in a very traditional Christmas song that I think it's a very beautiful use of the word, and it's a very powerful use of the word that speaks to us. So it's a complicated word in some ways, as to in some aspects to struggle with it, but in other ways to really love the word too. So.
So we're all struggling a little bit with that particular sort of combination of righteousness and where that fits in things. And I have to admit I can't sort of quote chapter and verse at the moment, but it seems to me that whole allegory of flood, about the world being so out of balance that the only way of doing something about it is to start over. It seems to me that the story was about greed, that there was sort of the building up, the whole thing of the Tower of Babel, and that people had started to break relationship with one another, and it had got so bad that the only way to restore God's sense of righteousness, as in, I really like the word. I really like that sense of balance as a identifier for righteousness. The only way of restoring God's balance was to find a person who was willing to not be motivated by greed, but to be motivated by God's thirst for balance and fairness and justice for all. So I'd say that might be more where I'm coming from. But I think, Rodney, it's a good point to bring that. I mean, it's clearly a biblical use of the term righteousness, that they talked about God's righteousness and then Noah's righteousness in that story, for sure. But I think Borg would challenge us to embrace that word in a different way, even in that story.
I don't know. Oh, go ahead.
I just want to quote page 140, where Borg says, "Note how the kingdom of God and righteousness are linked, but is striving for the kingdom of God and God's righteousness about being holier than thou? The saying sounds very different with justice. The kingdom of God seeks God's justice in contrast to human injustice." I really like that.
See, I have less trouble connecting righteousness with justice than I do with knowing that in the U.S. context, whenever I use the word justice from the pulpit, a majority of the congregation is going to think criminal or punitive justice. And I know that Borg addresses that. I think those of us who get into theological reading, we get used to the social justice definition that we find in Scripture. That nobody else hears that when they hear the word justice. And I think there's a big gap there with that word from the pulpit and the pew. between the pulpit and the pew.
I certainly hear you there, and that's exactly what I think sitting in the pew too. Maybe a different way of saying it would be what is just, instead of justice, let's talk about what is just and what is fair. So yeah, I hear you.
What's interesting is if you read things online, Facebook or whatever, a recent pejorative that gets used a lot is social justice warriors, SJW for short, and used as an insult for the left wingers kind of thing, and that's where the that response comes from. So at the same time, yeah, I think justice is one of those very loaded words that almost needs immediate definition upon saying it from the pulpit for that very reason, because it does get heard. And in this group, there are very different, like your experience is very different, Don. So say a bit more about that, Don. Because, yeah, I am going to put you on the spot. Go for it.
Yeah. Kathy, you shocked me. I don't think I've ever once heard the word justice where I thought of specifically the legal justice system.
Or punishment?
Oh, not punishment at all. Fairness, equality.
Okay.
Yeah, all those words come to mind, but never punitive.
You've been well United Church trained.
I guess so. I don't know. But now you're going to have me thinking when I use that. Whoa, what's people going to interpret?
Bill here from Emmanuel. Thank you about justice, fairness, equal rights, so forth. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Sorry, we had a bit of crosstalk here and we missed what you just said.
I was thanking her for talking about justice as fairness, as equal treatment, as equality. Thank you. I was thanking her for her comment.
It is funny the disconnect between the word just and the word justice as an entity can go either of those directions, whereas talking about something that is just almost always puts a person into at least thinking about fairness. And yet, it's such a clear connection between the words, but the way that they get heard, I think just will almost always be heard correctly, whereas justice can be heard in different ways. That's a good thing to raise.
Has anybody here had justice as the legal system? So she just said, yeah.
Yep.
Did you? You? No.
You want the justice
Well,
side?
I wonder if I could ask the same question of the U.S. side, because I have my suspicions that the word justice gets heard differently over here. But do you all, when you hear the word justice, think of fairness, or do you think of legal justice? I think so too. I think there's a real cultural difference here.
That's an interesting cultural difference, given that our very Declaration of Independence uses the word justice in the sense of being just and fair. But our cultural diversion from that has been incredible, and I wonder if it isn't, a number of things that have gone on, and today's generations have seen so much television that's full of criminal justice shows, and the whole thing where someone's done wrong and they have to seek justice, which is like reparations or getting even for things that have happened. So the whole meaning of that word justice has changed dramatically over the course of many, many decades.
To add more confusion, I think anytime a modifier is attached to the word justice in the popular media, whether it's social justice or economic justice, there are those commentators who want to raise suspicions. There was a number of years ago when there was a conservative political commentator who actually told folks, if your pastor mentions the phrase economic justice, that is a code word for Marxism, and you need to talk to their bishop. That was said. I'll tell you all who later. That person doesn't think that anymore, which is interesting. But a conservative political commentator said that on the air.
Wow.
About the just society.
Oh, yeah.
We had a primitive man on that. Just society. And I often think of, I think of the just society thing of Plato. He wrote 150 pages throughout his Republic.
We're only getting part of that. I'm sorry.
Yeah.
So are we. Yeah, Don was bringing that back to Plato and the whole, and also within Canadian recent political history, the idea of the just society. And but again, the word just is a lot easier to get properly than justice. And yeah, I think that because justice, again, using sort of Borg's method of saying, well, here's what it means in a dictionary, justice is a broadly used word in news and in society and in entertainment. And I mean, even for me, if I hear a story saying that, that it was mentioned the sense of getting even, or that kind of retribution, or someone's got to pay for this. You know, a family who is grieving a family member that has been killed, and they're seeking justice. And the news media doesn't go any further in explaining what they mean by that, because they know that what people are going to hear from that. Oh yeah, getting even, you know, like making sure that someone pays for that. And how hard it is then, if we're using it in a Christian context, to talk about God's understanding of justice and Jesus' understanding of justice being something that is so completely different from that. It's a hard word to redeem, but almost more from the secular side.
I agree. Oh,
so
go ahead, please.
Oh. Okay, so you know, and I think the same you were doing, kind of asking who thinks of the judicial system or whatever when you hear the word justice, and we were doing the same thing here. And a few people said, well, it depends on, you know, the situation and everything. So when I was thinking of the word justice, I was thinking of it as used in the pulpit, like within the Christian community. And yes, your example of when somebody's killed and somebody wants justice, I mean, yes, that's a different definition, but I was responding to it in terms of from the pulpit, which is what you raised originally.
But
and I think, I'm not sure, folks, would you think from the pulpit if it was raised, would you consider it as a judicial, or do you have a fairness kind of? Yeah, I think everybody on our side, hearing it from the pulpit, would think of fairness. Oh, yeah.
It occurs to me the way the word gets heard primarily in the U.S. is unfortunate for another reason. And that's because Scripture is so clear that people of faith, God's people, are supposed to seek justice. This is something that shouldn't divide progressive Christians from more literalistic understandings of Scripture, because this is a clear scriptural call that people of God are supposed to seek justice. There's no, you don't need to understand metaphorical meaning to hear that call, but yet we hear it, at least on our side, as something different because the term has been co-opted.
It's kind of an imprinting thing where people imprint their definition of justice on the word, much like we each imprint our own idea of what God is onto the image of God. And there's all different kinds of inferences there, as we talked earlier.
I'm looking at the time, we haven't talked about mercy yet.
Okay. Oh, good point. Just a quick point that Sim just made. She said, looking at the time and realizing we haven't talked about mercy at all. I thought that the point that was made about mercy versus compassion was really, really helpful, because mercy is one of those words that, whether we like it or not, does tend to have an implied inequality, that somehow I'm above someone in order to grant mercy to them, whereas compassion doesn't assume an above and below. And I'm just going to toss that out as comment, if anyone wants to reply to that.
So, well, I guess Borg says that in the ancient world, mercy equaled compassion, and that it was like to feel with somebody, and it was a womb like nurturing. And I think that speaks to me, just like what Greg just said, much more than, okay, I'll give mercy on you but not you. So forth. I think we're called to just be, to nurture and ourselves.
I like so much that he used the reference of saying that mercy was not to be confused with forgiveness, because in the case of forgiveness, it's always like somebody's done something wrong to first have to be forgiven. Whereas if mercy is compassion, you can be present in the suffering, you can be supportive of that suffering without the other person ever having to have committed any error of any kind.
Was there anything in particular, Sin, that you saw in that, having raised it?
I think we all can agree that a compassion in relation to mercy is a very good word, a very good understanding. But at the end of the chapter, Borg goes back a little bit on mercy. That mercy, in the old-fashioned sense of the word, has a role. He says, in times when we have a strong sense of having sinned, the common meaning of the word mercy can have deep meaning. So he's not, I don't think he's totally dismissing that mercy can never be that you show somebody mercy. it can be in certain circumstances when somebody has done wrong to somebody, and that other person say, "Well, I forgive you," I'll have mercy on you, or whatever. So it's not totally. It's only compassion. There's definitely another meaning to mercy, and that fits in some circumstances, I think. Page 131. Yeah.
One thing I'd like to introduce. Oh, go ahead. Go ahead.
I'm just thinking of mercy as if someone's been sick for a long time, and you're praying or asking somebody to have mercy on them, as if to have they had enough, or is it feeling maybe feeling kind of sorry for them, just hoping things get better, or just that's what I'm thinking of mercy right now. So.
Yeah, that compassionate release or relief or deliverance for sure. I guess something I wanted to say out loud tonight, as we've been looking at all these words, it reminds me of something, Laura, that you have brought in front of us a couple of times around understanding these things communally rather than just personally. How important it is for us to strive for a community that is governed by these potentially wonderful words and wonderful concepts, rather than just, again, limiting it down to me being in right relationship with God, and broadening it out to all of us being in right relationship with all of the others, all of creation.
Earlier in the discussion, Mike brought up this article that he read on the internet concerning the church, and that you can be a Christian without necessarily have to go to church every Sunday. But if we talk about being a communion, it has to start with the church. That's where we come together, and Mike did mention that. But that's where we come together, and that's where a lot of the mercy or compassion that can be shown shown through the prayer of the members of the church, and justice and righteousness can be shown through the members of the church. So I think that, and even this discussion that we have with you is because of our church. So, even though the internet guy said that the church, you don't have to go to church all the time, but there is a place for church, and it's in this community.
I thank you for that, Rodney. And I didn't mean to infer that we should not be going to church, that it didn't have a place. Among all these here, I see the lightning bolts about to strike. It is, community is essential to our faith. And the development of community is what we do in our church worship time and our church activity. But if that were the only thing we did, then we wouldn't be followers of Christ, because that's not what Jesus taught his disciples to do, to stay in a closed room and to only worship among themselves. He taught them to outreach, to do mission work, to feed the hungry, to take care of the poor, to reach out and make disciples of all nations. So they fit hand in hand. You can't have necessarily one without the other, because none of us is strong enough without the support of community to be the kind of Christian we'd like to become, even economically.
I'm reminded of a pastor friend, a church where I worshiped for a couple of years, about 10 years ago. And one Sunday, this was a church that was a large church, and it was a growing church, and they were all pretty happy with the way things were going with their Sunday attendance. And Pastor Harry had the courage to say, he said, you know, it's wonderful to see so many of you here on Sunday. And he said, but you know what? That's the easy part. He said, the hard part is to then go from this gathering on Sunday and to exactly what you were saying, Mike, to be people of who go into the world and act as Christ in the world around you, that treat others with respect, that share the good news. And I thought at the time that was a fairly gutsy thing to say to a church that was quite proud of its attendance, and I think he knew that. So. So anything else? We are kind of at that time. Any closing thoughts from the Ralph Connor contingent? Hmm. Yeah. So any closing thoughts from your side? I think at that point of the night.
Bill here from Emmanuel. Thank you for your sharing for all of us from here, and thank you for your sharing from your community. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Just to make sure we're on the same page, so to speak, for next week we're looking at chapters 15, 16, and 17. Okay. Okay.
Are we skipping
Yep.
sin?
Yeah, John 3:16 and born again and the
Or
only
is that
way.
tonight's?
15,
We'll
16.
pick that up in January, I think.
So, Laura or Chris, could you close us with a blessing?
Let us pray. Beloved God, we are grateful that you have called us your beloved. As we embark upon the season of Advent, the season of expectant hope, help us to trust in that belovedness so that together we may seek to live upon your good earth in ways that are just and compassionate and free from fear. Amen.
Amen.
Good night.
Thank you, friends. Talk with you next week.
Thank you, everybody. I know we went late tonight, later than usual. I appreciate everyone's participation. And if you didn't